Thank you, Andres. Thank you, Jorge, for the invitation to come back to ORT. 26 years ago, I gave a talk to the Uruguayan Foreign Ministry about the prospects for peace in the Middle East, and I hope it wasn't recorded because I'm sure that everything I said was incorrect. And I say that as a precaution because the Israeli election was held 2 days ago, and anything could happen in the next couple of months. In fact, anything I say now might be wrong by the time I finish my talk, because things are very dynamic. Around 25 years ago, the Israeli government was about to fall in 1991, and they were voting in the Israeli Knesset, and one of the parties which had promised that it would vote against the government basically changed its mind at the last minute. So that anybody who studies or looks at Israeli politics is important because, especially now, the future government of Israel will impact on the whole relationship with the Palestinians, on the regional politics of the Middle East, and of course, as we know, the regional politics of the Middle East impacts globally on issues of oil, on terrorism, on stability. So therefore, though it's just one small country, this has been defined as maybe one of the most critical elections and the outcome for Israel, but also for the region, and how it will impact on the outcome. So now, if you look carefully, it says Israeli elections 2019 and not Israeli election, because we actually are in election part 2. This was the second election of the year. There was a first election in April. There was no outcome. There was a failure to form a government, so that Israel had to go back to the polls for a second attempt, and we will find out shortly whether that helped or whether it's nothing has changed. So let me, before I begin, just give a little 2-minute background so those of you who actually know what are we talking about when we talk about the Israeli elections. So the Knesset is the Israeli parliament, has 120 seats. Now, so therefore, to form a government, you need a majority, you need 61. You need, now, no Israeli party has ever won in the history of Israel 61 seats. So that Israeli politics and Israeli government is always coalitions. It's always maneuvering between coalitions and bargaining. You vote for a party, not for a candidate. And in recent years, it's a proportional representation system. It used to be 1% of the vote was sufficient to enter the Knesset. So what you would have in the past with lots and lots of small single parties. They moved the threshold to 3.25% to get into the Knesset. And then the final part of the puzzle is that after the election, the Israeli president, who doesn't have constitutional powers, it's very primarily a symbolic ceremonial role of the president, will choose a leader of a party to try and form a government. So that's the process of how this all works. Now, the other thing that you need to know is that in some respects, Israeli parties, political parties, are not really political parties as we understand political parties. They are often just groups of individuals who come together for an election and often will split after an election, rather than deep parties with long historical roots. In fact, what you have is these groups of amalgam of different groups. Sometimes the parties are led by one person who then chooses the list. So that individuals are really critical. When we talk about Israeli politics and the elections and forming a government, we are really talking about a give and take between certain individuals. So anybody who likes spy thrillers or mysteries or murders and intrigues would love Israeli politics, because Israeli politics is all about personal rivalries. It's all about personal hatreds. It's all about tricks. It's all about trying to outmaneuver. And here are some of the main characters of the play. So to your left is Benjamin Netanyahu, the sitting Israeli Prime Minister, who has been the longest serving Israeli Prime Minister for over 11 years, but has entered into this election and the election in April under the threat of criminal charges. So for corruption, at least 4 or 5 cases which has been put through by the Attorney General, which will actually come to a head in October, where he may face trial. So therefore he's also fighting for his political life and also for his personal life at the same point. To the right, another big circle, is Benny Gantz. Now Benny Gantz is the head of a new party, or a new group. It's actually a group of 4 different parties or 4 individuals called Blue and White. Gantz was a popular former chief of staff who formed this party with 2 other former chiefs of staff and one other person who had a party, Yair Lapid, called Blue and White. And really their main purpose of coming together is to get rid of Netanyahu. If you ask what is their ideology, it's anything but. So this was a way of coming together. They put their egos aside, and who would be the leader? Imagine 3 former chiefs of staff have to decide which one of them is going to actually lead the party. Now, 3 other characters. In the top left-hand corner is Avigdor Lieberman. Lieberman is a critical part of our story tonight. He is if you want to take it as a Shakespearean play, he is the central figure. He is the kingmaker. He is the winner. He used to be Netanyahu's personal advisor around 20 years ago, formed his own party, which was primarily a party for the Russian immigrants in Israel, but basically is to the right of Netanyahu in some of his ideology, but has also taken on the tack of being against the religious parties. But equally important is that he hates Netanyahu with a vengeance. Next to him is Ayelet Shaked, who equally dislikes Netanyahu. And more critically, Netanyahu's wife equally dislikes her. She is the leader of a right-wing party. She used to be in the Likud, and she is on that kind of brink of a right-wing party of a coalition. And then the final character is Ayam Odeh, who is the leader of the Arab parties. Okay, so these are some of the characters I'm going to be talking about because they're critical players in this play of today and of tonight. Now, the important part of knowing about an Israeli election is that this is a 3-part play. There is the campaign, there is the results, and then there's a coalition building. And in some respects, you can ignore you can miss the campaign and still watch the election results. It's like watching a basketball game. You can just come for the last quarter and not really know what went on in the first half. So that but this year, it's a 4-part play. There's a prequel. So we have to take our story back, because otherwise none of it makes sense, back to April of 2019. Because I said this is about the Israeli elections and not election. So we have here the breakdown. So 120 seats. Now if you go from the purple, the number 4, These are the coalition of what you might call to Netanyahu of the right wing. 35 is what the Likud got. You do the maths, and it comes to 65. Okay, so it looks as if here in April 1919, 4 or 5 months ago, Netanyahu is going to be prime minister. He's won the election. It looks as if he's certain to form a government. He has 65 of his coalition. You have the blue, the two number 8s are the religious parties who are the natural allies. You have the brown, the number 5, which is the United Right, the religious far right, the right-wing parties. These are his natural allies, and number 4, Kulanu, is a party which somebody who was in the Likud, left the Likud, ran separately, and got 4. So why do we have another election? Because Avigdor Lieberman, with barely 5 seats, literally on his way out, in the past he had much more, a fading star of Israeli politics, decided that he was not going to join Netanyahu in the government. He had decided that his new card was going to be that he would not sit with the religious parties. There's a big secular religious divide. A lot of the votes, a lot of the population are angered by what they call the political power of the religious parties. And Lieberman decided he wasn't joining the government. So, deadlock. In the end, it's a bit of a complicated story, but the end result is that they had to call a new election. Now, some people thought that Lieberman was mad. He was going to be offered a good post in the government, but he decided to gamble. This was seen by some as a suicide mission by Lieberman, driven not by political smarts, but by personal hatred and animosity of Netanyahu. So that's where we were in April. Now, just before we go a little bit further, just let's see what the numbers come to. So the numbers are 35-35. Kahol Levan, which is blue and white by Benny Gantz, the new party, gets the same number as the Likud, but neither can form a government. Now, there are 3 important zeros there. The 3 important zeros are the first one, Hayamin HaChadash, which is Ayelet Shaked. Ayelet Shaked and somebody called Naftali Bennett failed to cross the 3.25% margin and didn't get any seats. So whilst I had Ayelet Shaked as a big part of our play, at this point, she's out. Zehut is another party, which is a very strange party, led by one person with a combination of fanatical right-wing religious views and a pro-cannabis stance. Don't ask me to explain how these come together, but but it might be that was a way of getting some votes. And then you have Gesher, which is also 0. But this is the way that it ended up. And it's important because let's move to the next election. So here we have, and unfortunately I don't know, it doesn't come out on the slide properly. So here we have the results of the election as of now, which is so the Likud. So what you have here, actually, unfortunately, the slide comes out terribly, because to the left you have Kahol Lavan, of Gantz, who actually gets 33 votes, 33 seats. The Likud has dropped to 31. So Netanyahu, who pulled a trick to call new elections, was expected to get to that magical increase, has actually dropped, but has actually dropped a little bit more. Because in the Likud, Kulanu, that party of four, joined the Likud and ran together. Zehut joined Likud. So in fact, the Likud actually had close to 41 seats in terms of votes last time, and they've dropped to 31. So, the joint list I'll come to. The Arab parties in April ran separately. This time, they ran together. And you can see that they've gone from 10 to 13, and they actually increased their power. The most Yamina, which is 5 to 7, Yamina was a party of the old right, and Ayelet Shaked joining them. She became the leader of Yamina, so all of a sudden she's back. She's back, but let me tell you something. Yamina, which was a group of two parties coming together for the election, split yesterday. So that lasted for as long as 24 hours. So now there are two separate parties in the Knesset. But look who the real winner is. The real winner is Avigdor Lieberman. Avigdor Lieberman goes up from 5 to 8. The suicide mission, which people thought he was going to have, has changed. So, this is a map. It puts all the religious parties, Yamina, and the religious parties across on the left. Okay, and if you add all that up, it comes to, I think, 55. And if you add all the parties to the left of the yellow, it comes to 57. Okay, now the orange ones here at the far left are the Arab parties. And this is a problem because the Arab parties will not be seen as part of a coalition. They're not acceptable in Israeli politics to be part of any ruling coalition. They've never been part of any ruling coalition. But those of you who are quick and have done your maps will suddenly see that we have deadlock again. That nobody can get to 61 without Lieberman deciding who he's going to anoint as the king. So this is where we're back again at marginally different. We have Kahol Lavan, Benny Gantz, though they lost 2 seats because other parties gained, as now the largest party. The Likud has come down to 31. The right wing cannot form a government of 61, but nor can the centre left equally form a government. So, what happens now? So, as I said, this is a 3-part play, and we're a long, long way from the end. So we've had election day. We then have the official results, which will be published, I think, in the next 24 to 48 hours. And here I'm really cautious, because one seat, if you look at how it plays, one change could shift that balance between different sides. But we're soon going to have the official results published. The president then consults with party leaders. You then have the new Knesset is actually entered into power. And then the fun begins. Then the fun begins, which is coalition negotiations. So how does this work? Whoever the president decides to give first go, And of course, Netanyahu is saying, I should have first go. I have this big block of 55. Gantz is saying, I should have the first go. I've got 33 seats. I'm the largest party. Whoever is given the nod has 30 days to form a government. If he or she fails, they have another 30 days to form a government. And then if he or she fails again, then the president can ask somebody else. So, where are we? We're in September. Christmas, we should know if there's going to be a government. Okay? It could take that long to do this. So, as I said, here we got the two potential prime ministers. Israeli politics back in the 80s gave us a new concept, a new political concept of rotation, of rotating prime ministers. This has happened before in Israel, where one leader is prime minister for 2 years and then another is for the next 2 years. But here we have in the middle Lieberman. Now this is kind of critical, because what was really important to Netanyahu, who actually called the elections back in April, was that in April, one of his conditions, or the price that he wanted and was prepared to pay to the far-right parties, was that he would have immunity from prosecution. In Israel, a sitting minister or prime minister is not immune from prosecution. In some countries, that's not the case, and they wanted a law to be brought in where Netanyahu would be immune from prosecution. Lieberman, Gantz has said that he will not sit in a coalition with Netanyahu as prime minister, because you cannot have Netanyahu, or even as a minister, under corruption. He will sit with the Likud, but not with Netanyahu. Lieberman has said that he will only support a national unity government. But he will only support a national unity government without the religious, because he campaigned against religious coercion. So the real trick is how do we balance all of this out? So, what's about to happen? This is the image of the next 3 to 4 months. We've just had the elections, and we now go through this roller coaster. Already, as I said, one party has split. Netanyahu is trying to create a block of 55 that they will only go in together. So let me just very briefly, and then I'll open it up for questions about what the implications are and who are the winners and losers to date. So as you can most probably picked up, the big loser is Netanyahu. Yeah. Back in April, when the election results came out, if you go back and Google Israeli elections, April 2019, you will see headlines, Netanyahu, the next prime minister of Israel. Netanyahu wins. Now Netanyahu has come much, much weaker. He still controls the party, but he's no longer in that position that there's any possibility without Lieberman and the religious parties of forming a government. Lieberman, I say this carefully, because his new secular anti-religious is new, and it may not be genuine, because if he's offered something like Minister of Defense or even rotation as Prime Minister, everything is possible. It looks Netanyahu is not going to be the Prime Minister, or at best that he will have to be in rotation. It looks a very important date is October the 2nd. or beginning of October. October is when you have the pre-trial hearing. It's now certain that the pre-trial hearing will take place before he goes for a full court hearing on indictment. If he'd won the election, it would have been very hard for the Attorney General to follow this through. Now Netanyahu is weak. Another sign of Netanyahu's weakness, he was meant to go to New York next week to the UN General Assembly. He was meant to meet President Trump. Netanyahu decided he was going to stay at home. Now we all know that when the king leaves the castle, the coup takes place. He decided he wasn't. But not only that, I could have got a picture. There was pictures all over Israel in the campaign of Netanyahu and Trump against these big skyscrapers with this word Netanyahu in a different league. But he and Trump were together. He was a world leader. Now, interestingly, two things happened in the last week. One, Netanyahu started to talk about not how he was Trump's best friend, but how he was the best person to deal with a possible peace plan by Trump against Israel. Netanyahu was pushing to create this idea of a right-wing government. 2 days before the election, he held a cabinet meeting in a West Bank settlement to show, he talked about that he would annex the West Bank. So he was beginning to try to gain that right-wing support. Donald Trump was asked yesterday about the outcome of the Israeli election, and those words which he has been fond of saying for the last 18 months, my good friend Bibi, were not uttered by Trump. It was, we support Israel, whoever the leader is. So all of a sudden, my good friend Bibi, my good friend Donald, I'm going to the photo opportunity at the UN. Netanyahu's fighting for his political life. But don't count him out. This guy is a fighter, he's a scraper, and it's too early. I'm not going to go, I know it's being filmed, so I'm not going to go on record as saying that Netanyahu will not be Prime Minister of Israel. So who else wins and loses? Well, Benny Gantz, kind of won. If Netanyahu fought a really dirty, vicious campaign, full of energy, fight, breaking all the rules, Gantz went, and his other two chiefs of staff, went through the election campaign sleepwalking. An awful campaign. Low key, low energy, people had kind of already given up. And what it's clear is that 25% of the Israeli population is solid. It's solid, and that Gantz was probably now is in a position slightly stronger than he was in April. The other winner, which we talked about, is Lieberman, the kingmaker. Another one is Ayelet Shaked, who's back in the mix and is already sticking the knife into Netanyahu today when she says the leaders have to understand, because Netanyahu is saying that he will lead the next government, and she's saying it has to be a national unity government. The idea of a right-wing government has gone. So she's back in that mix. And the Arab parties. The Arab parties now, after Gantz, the Blue and White and the Likud, are the third largest party in the Knesset. They've had the largest vote ever. They have 13 seats. In April, one of the things that Netanyahu did, in the very dying moments of the election campaign, of the day of the election, was he went onto Facebook and he said, come out and get the vote because the Arabs are voting in droves. A clear anti-Arab message. He even used the word, and it's from Hebrew, of we're on standby, and the word to use was kononut. Now, kononut is not danger on standby. Kononut is what the army uses when it's a call-up. So it had a very loaded meaning. So, if you incite, you intimidate. They wanted to put cameras in the polling booths. It all backfired. Instead, as one of the Arab politicians said, this time we did vote in droves. And we are now in a critical place where it's very likely that the Arab party, Ayman Auda, will nominate Gantz to have the first chance of forming a government. So it's like a game of chess. Things have only shifted marginally from April to September, but they've shifted massively in terms of the impact. So, just to conclude, then I'll open it to questions. The outcome. So the outcome is that we're still at stalemate. We're still at stalemate. No person can form a government. There is that old riddle that a farmer has got a boat and he's got to take to the other side a wolf, a sheep, and a cabbage. So how does he get from one side of the river to the other side of the river without the wolf eating the sheep or the sheep eating the cabbage? Yeah. How are we going to form all of this? This is going to be, there will be shifts, there will be surprises in the next month or 2 months. Maybe Lieberman will sit with one of the religious parties because he's a good friend of one of the leaders. So you never know that they could be talking together. Yeah. What's being offered? Maybe Gantz will be able to persuade 4 or 5 members of the Likud to move across to join his party. Because one of the chiefs of staff in his party, Bougie Yaelon, used to be in the Likud. The idea that these are separate parties with very distinct ideologies, these are individuals who cross and move. Maybe 4 or 5 of the blue and white party will move across to the Likud. You never know what's going on. But I think the real question, and I think the real response, is that there will be a national unity government. It will mean that this rightward shift that Israel has been going through, this possibility that you would have an extreme right-wing party, the small right-wing parties would control Netanyahu, who would, because he is trying to escape corruption charges, and talked about annexation, talked about having to take measures which would please them, has finished for the moment. That this shift to the right wing, people even said that Israeli politics was facing the abyss of moving into a right-wing, autocratic, authoritarian government, and stepped back. So there could well be a national unity government. But what is national unity? Is it as Lieberman says, a secular national unity, where the religious parties will not be part of? But that means that the Likud will have to break a 20, 30-year alliance with the religious parties, who've been seen as natural allies. What happens to the religious parties? Because if Israel does form a national unity government, and you can see Likud and Kahol Lavan and Lieberman, plus the Labour Party and the Democratic Union, which has Barak, another former chief of staff, you could have a coalition of 80, very stable, ideologically pretty uniform, could deal with some of the economic challenges that Israel's going to face. There's a slight downturn in the economy, and the religious parties will be out. That could be a disaster for the religious parties. It could change the face of Israeli society. It will impact on the relationship of the Palestinians. And then finally, there is the final outcome. and that in January will be in part 3 of this play. That this will be like one of those never-ending sagas, that we will have another election. Now, that could be possible, because although the political parties and the Israeli public do not want an election, okay? Political leaders don't often calculate rationally. Netanyahu actually was the person who triggered this second election, because he believed that he would win it out. And therefore, he lost. Lieberman, who was the trigger of the trigger, won. Politicians, not just Israeli, but Israeli in particular, but politicians are high-wire gamblers. And they try to gamble on who will be punished and how the Israeli public are sick of the politicians. They're sick. This was an unnecessary election, and it's pretty clear that Israel is split down the middle. 32, 31, 33, 35, but 2 blocks are more or less split. So it is in some ways highly consequential, because it will determine where Israel is going, the prospects of any revival of talks with the Palestinians. And at the other level, this election and the other one just tells us one thing, not unique to Israel, that Israel is stuck. That it's stuck, that it's a split society, it's split down the middle. And as I was saying to Andreas in the past, in science, we can do an experiment, and the outcome of the experiment is that then we do the experiment again, and slowly we get change. And we can repeat the experiment 5, 10, 15, 20 times. And slowly one substance will form into another if you repeat the experiment numerous times. That could also be true in politics. Only politics, you've got population. My guess is that we will have a national unity government, because Israel could not face a third election. My answer, if anybody asks me who will be the next Prime Minister of Israel, will be, it could be Gantz, or it could be Bibi, or it could be anybody. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Peters, Joel, for this interesting presentation. If we believe here in Uruguay that our election and our political party was complicated, forget it. This is a real complicated system. Before we go into the questions, I'm sure there are so many. I have a question for you, yeah. Joel. Is there, I know it never happened in the past, but is there any possibility that in the near future we can see the Arab Party being part of the coalition, or doesn't make any sense what I'm saying? No,
the answer is no, they will not be part of the coalition. One or two politicians from the Democratic Union and from the Labour Party are beginning to say that it's time to bring the Arabs into government. They are a sizable part of the population. They've got 13%. But basically, the Arab parties are kind of being delegitimized. And especially in the last campaign, in fact, Netanyahu has already said that there are only 2 options coming out of this election. A government led by me, or a left-wing government, casting Gantz and the others as left-wing, and an anti-Zionist government led in cooperation with the Arabs. So, no, Israeli politics is too far away from that situation.
In view of Israel's mounting social polarization, right, and considering that going forward political stalemates are likely to continue, if not to get worse, would you think it would make sense for Israel to change its governing system?
Yes and no, it won't happen. So political reform or electoral reform has been one of those issues in Israeli politics. I was involved in discussions back in the early 90s where there was, after this there was a previous era where you had the rotation and people said it's time to change the political system. The most that they've done is to move it from 1% threshold to the 3.25. The 3.25 has forced parties to run together and to create these amalgams. But the problem of electoral reform is very simple. Firstly, it's twofold. What system are you going to have? Okay? Well, actually, there's three problems. Firstly, what system are you going to have? Because there are numerous options. Constituencies, proportional representation, a mix and match. I mean, I was involved in these discussions where you had all the comparative political science experts, the electoral experts come together, and you've got like 20 options. So which of the 20 options are you going to choose? But more critically, and this is why it won't happen, that the only way that you will get electoral reform to come through is that it has to be passed by the Knesset, by the government. And as the old phrase goes, you never get turkeys voting for Christmas. Yeah. Because any system is going to lead to the dilution of some parties. So therefore, you're never going to get, and I think it's not just a 61 majority, enough votes to agree on a system where you actually are talking about a system which could reduce your actual power. So yes, it needs it, but no, it won't happen. Yeah.
So the left parties, mainly Avodah, ruled Israel from its beginning to almost this century, for 40, 50 years. So I want to know why and how did they get from being a huge majority in Israel to an almost disappearance of the electoral sphere?
That's a great question. And part of it is that even the Labour Party, which ruled for so many years, was a coalition of different sub-parties. And what you had was that it's very interesting that I can put you up a map of only 15, 20 years ago, where you actually had Labour and Likud at around 45 each. And people saw this was going to be the return of a two-party system. You didn't need electoral reform. Basically, through a lack of political rivalries, political leadership, a lack of an ideology, it disappeared. Now, in some respects, you could actually say that the blue and white party and the people who are voting for it and the fact that it is actually just a collection of individuals are the constituent votes of the old Labour Party. What you had was a party which just died of its own inertia, its own terrible political mistakes. I mean, in the 2015 election, it had 24-25. It is one of the tragic stories, but it is maybe one of the few parties that are left as a political party, but it sort of ran its course. It didn't really have an ideology anymore. It didn't really have a revival of its leadership. But it is one, I'm not really answering your question specifically because it is one of those mysteries of how a party did, because it was hated by the Likud supporters. It got caught in the post-collapse of the peace process, of a party identified with the failure of the peace process. It was a mixture of a lack of leadership and a lack of a political platform in which to deal with the problems of Israeli society. And the remarkable thing about Blue and White and Gantz is that this isn't a party. This hasn't even got the pretense of becoming a political party. This is a group of individuals trying to just put forward a platform of saying we are a charismatic set of figures who are best suited to run the country. We are the best people to challenge Bibi. I have to say I am frankly quite surprised because the Gantz experiment, which was in April, where they didn't manage to sort of overcome the Likud, where you sort of said, if you can't beat Netanyahu on the security card, you can't put three superstars, popular former chiefs of staff, who say that Netanyahu is a danger to the security of the country. Then what you're realizing is that you can't just change the mix and put the latest sort of shining white knight. You need actually to build it up on ideology. You need to have a whole grassroots movement. The interesting thing is that whilst they did not defeat Netanyahu and they only got to about 25%, it didn't dissipate. Many people thought it would collapse this time. That, in fact, the surprising thing is that they stood together for 4 months, because these are people who came together for one election. So if they come into government, maybe they will build a party from the grassroots, but there's no indication. So the only way really for the Labour Party or for what is now called the National Democrats, or the old Meretz, is really to go for the long run, is to build up Israeli, to build a grassroots movement which appeals to people and their core needs. But Israeli politics and Israeli elections are always about the next election rather than building for the long run. And that,
Considering what the different candidates have been proposing or have been saying that they will do, what's the repercussion that the different possible prime ministers could bring to the region and to the image of Israel itself, and what could be the repercussions, for example, in the Palestinian conflict specifically?
So, Gantz's message was, I'm not Bibi. So, I mean, it may sound very simplistic, it may sound very crude and not really answers your question, because somebody might now be a prime minister, so what's he bringing to the table? Somebody described the blue and white party. As I said, some of the labels don't really apply to Israel. So we have to sort of create this chart, and we have to say that everything to that side is to the left, and everything to this side is to the right. When in fact, blue and white, the Kahol Lavan, is not really a left-wing party. It's not even a centre-left party. It's not in the traditional understandings of a centrist party or a social democratic party. Somebody described it as a more pleasant and polite right-wing party. A more rational, and it's not led by Netanyahu, who has kind of got to the point where the party is him and he's the party, and so that a lot of people were voting for anything but Netanyahu. So what does it mean if Gantz is prime minister? Or even if it's a national unity government? Because that, I think, is where you ask. Well, Netanyahu was making pacts with the far right. This other party, which isn't on the chart, Otzma, which is basically a far-right racist party, did not get into the Knesset. But Netanyahu, in the last election, got the right-wing parties to unite, so they form a bloc, so that you have people who would have been off the pale in Israeli politics 10, 15, 20 years ago, now sitting in the Israeli parliament and potentially critical coalition partners to a government, to a prime minister that even if he only had a majority of 65 in April, would always have to be looking over his shoulder. So therefore you will have that type of extremism which was coming into the Israeli politics, and the Israeli discourse will be pulled back. You'll have it much more in a much more sort of tone where maybe some of the policies might not be critically different, but the tone and the presentation and the implication. You will have, secondly, if you do get a broad government, Israel might be able to deal with some of the social problems that it deals with. It will address this real critical problem which has always been underneath Israeli society, and that is the ultra-Orthodox and the religious coercion. Somebody said, so when did Lieberman, who's actually, he's on the right, he lives in a West Bank settlement, his politics are to the right of Netanyahu. When did he suddenly become this centrist? When did he become this anti-secularist? When, in fact, he went to a shopping mall in a town called Ashdod, which is primarily population around 60 to 70% of Russians, which was open on Shabbat, on the Sabbath. After that visit, because the religious parties were running the Ministry of Interior, they shut the mall. Which then, of course, for a whole secular population, the Russians, people turned to Lieberman and said, what is going on? Why aren't you standing up? You claim to support us. You claim that you're for civil marriage. And Lieberman, I think, said that here's an opportunity. So there will be at some point a rollback, not a complete rollback, of the kind of religious power, or at least not a rollback, not a continuation. But this is a long-standing story. I could have been given the same answer in 1993 when I was last here. So it's like nothing dramatically new. And finally, about the Palestinian issue. Well, the Palestinian issue was absent from the politics of the election. The Palestinian issue is actually absent from Israeli politics at the moment. Nobody campaigned about alternative peace plans or alternative visions for peace. What Netanyahu did at the very last minute was to say that he did two contradictory things. He said he would annex the Jordan Valley. Not going to happen. But at least you can claim that I'm tough, I'm going to move, I'm going to do that. But that was the only real mention of the peace process. The other one was that he said he would be the best person to deal with the Trump plan, not to deal with the Palestinians, which was kind of ironic because all of a sudden he was beginning to say that Donald Trump might be the problem. But again, apart from those small efforts to sort of not gain votes from the left-hand side, but to get the votes from Yamina to come into the Likud. He wasn't campaigning against the left. He wasn't trying to bring votes across. He was trying to destroy Yamina. Because if he could get Yamina votes to Likud, he would have more. And therefore he would have, say, 33, and Gantz might have 31, and he would get the first chance. So this was all about the margins of mandates and not the politics of ideology. It might sound that we think about politics and about elections, about being competing visions of society, different leaderships, different political positions in which voters This is really the politics of identity and the politics of survival and the politics of leadership. You know, it might be a sad reflection of where Israeli politics is today, but this is really where you start. You have to know around 4 or 5, maybe 6 or 7 central characters. Maybe if there's a, well, here's several ifs. So any answer that begins with if, is not really an answer. But if there is a government in which Gantz is the Prime Minister, if there is a Trump peace plan which is delivered, if there are changes, incentives to the Palestinian Authority to engage, then one might see some movement where the Palestinian issue may return to Israeli politics. But at the moment, you could walk around and follow the Israeli campaign and not know that there was a conflict with the Palestinians. You might get Iran mentioned a bit, you might get Hamas mentioned, but peace and the peace process, that was my talk of 25 years ago.
If the president would grant General Gantz the first shot, would that mean that General Gantz becomes like an interim prime minister, or would Mr. Netanyahu remain until General Gantz forms a coalition?
Netanyahu, the outgoing government remains in power until the incoming government is sworn in. Now that creates a real problem, because do not underestimate Netanyahu. He is going to be the prime minister. I mean, I think his intention was to go to New York and to have a meeting with Trump to show that he is still in charge. And of course, then he got frightened. And there might be a possibility, though I'm only guessing here, so this is no quoting, but it might be a possibility that Trump might not have met him, which would have been even more humiliating. I mean, Trump's, a former US ambassador, tweeted after Trump's reply about the Israeli elections, and where he didn't mention Netanyahu, tweeted 2 words, ice cold. And Trump is known that when he sees, he does not have deep relationships. He sees somebody is no longer of any political value or as a loser, he will cut them off. So, but the answer is that Netanyahu will still be prime minister, and potentially prime minister for the next 60 days. If not, he will try to wade it out, but he will be given a chance to form a government. So he will do everything he can to prevent Gantz from forming a government. And 60 days in the Middle East is a long time. A lot can happen in 60 days. There was talk that Netanyahu was going to launch a military operation 10 days ago in order to postpone the Israeli election, and was prevented by the Attorney General and by the Defense Ministry, the Army chiefs, because he didn't want to bring that to a vote to the cabinet, to the Security Cabinet. And it's likely that he would have lost that vote in the Security Cabinet. So the Attorney General said, you cannot do this. And Netanyahu was not strong enough in the sense that he didn't feel he could go that way. But anything could happen. I mean, the situation in Gaza is highly unstable. It wasn't just that he was going to do a military operation out of nothing. The situation with Iran is with the attack on the Saudi oil fields, and where that leads to and what the US response will be. There's a long story here, and Netanyahu will be prime minister. And the most critical date to watch was 2 dates. One is, I think, October the 2nd, when President Rivlin will decide who he will give the first call to, and he will have to decide on somebody. I mean, it's not a case, I don't know. You know, even if it's a flick of a coin, somebody will be chosen. And then the other one is the pre-trial hearing of Netanyahu. It's going to be this image. This is exactly what it's going to be like. It's going to be one hell of a ride. So enjoy watching, because